The novel revolves around Colin MacDowell, a Scottish werewolf in his early 30s, who travels from Scotland to his late Aunt Geraldine's private island off Washington state's coast. Upon arrival, he's greeted by Knox Trevelyan, a fellow werewolf and pilot running an air taxi service for the influential Trevelyan pack. Colin learns that Knox had attempted to save his aunt, who passed away unexpectedly due to heart failure, underscoring the Trevelyan pack's loyalty despite the Whittier's preference for solitude. During his stay, Colin encounters Luna Reynaud, Aunt Geraldine's personal assistant, with whom he shares an undeniable connection. Their relationship evolves amidst the backdrop of dealing with Geraldine's estate and navigating the complex dynamics of the local werewolf community, led by Alpha George Trevelyan. George views Luna as a disruptive force and pressures her to leave Seattle, echoing past conflicts within the pack. Despite Colin's obligations in Scotland, his encounter with Luna shifts his priorities, and he realizes she has become the center of his world. They share intimate moments, such as browsing through a bookstore where Colin discovers a rare astronomy book he cherishes, symbolizing more than just a physical find. It represents the unexpected treasures life can bring. Their bond deepens with playful banter and stolen kisses in the midst of bookshelves, indicating a growing romantic attachment. Colin's determination to protect Luna from George's threats highlights his transition from duty-bound to love-driven, even as he acknowledges the challenges their relationship faces, given his responsibilities back home. Ultimately, the story is a blend of romance, supernatural elements, and personal transformation, as Colin grapples with his newfound love for Luna and the consequences of potentially uprooting his life for her. The narrative underscores themes of sacrifice, belonging, and the power of love to transcend boundaries, both geographical and societal, within the secretive world of werewolves. Chapter 1. Colin MacDowell was one jet-lagged werewolf. The trip from Scotland to Aunt Geraldine's private island off the coast of Washington state hadn't seemed this arduous the last time he'd made it. Apparently a 17-year-old pup could take more travel abuse than a 32-year-old were. A dark-haired werewolf named Knox Trevelyan had greeted Colin at SeaTac International on this balmy June afternoon, and had escorted him to a private helipad. Knox operated an air taxi service, one of many businesses owned by the powerful Trevelyan pack in the Seattle-Tacoma area. "I'm really sorry about your aunt," Knox said as he loaded Colin's suitcase and carried on into the helicopter. "Thank you." It was a shock. Colin was touched by the sincerity in Knox's voice. Colin's Scottish Aunt Geraldine and her Vancouver-born mate Henry Whittier had avoided Trevelyan pack politics in favor of a quiet existence on their little island. Henry's death a few years ago hadn't made much of a stir in the local community, which was how Geraldine had wanted it. Colin hadn't expected anyone to mourn Geraldine's passing either. "I was there when she died," Knox said. "Really?" "Yeah. Her personal assistant, Luna Reynaud, called me in the middle of the night. I flew over to the island with the best medical team in Seattle. They tried, but they couldn't save her. Her heart just gave out. So it was you who made that emergency run." Colin held out his hand to the pilot. "I can't tell you how much that means." Knox returned his handshake firmly. "I wish we'd been in time." From what her lawyer said, nobody could have made it in time. But considering how they'd avoided being part of the community, you went beyond what could be expected. They didn't have much of a pack mentality, but they donated generously to our environmental work. Colin nodded. "I did know about that. Besides, Geraldine was a hoot. I'd pick her up every month or so for her recreational shopping trips in Seattle. Even after Henry passed away, she still loved hitting the resale shops for designer clothes and shoes." "I'm sure she did." The thought was bittersweet. Geraldine had specified that the contents of her closet be donated to charity, so he'd see to it while he was there. She'd willed a few pieces of jewelry to the female staff members, and he'd distribute that too. Knox sighed. "Damn shame. Well, might as well get you over there." "Right." Colin climbed into the small chopper. Once he was settled in, his jet-lagged brain nudged him to do the polite thing and ask how the Trevelyan pack was faring. "Quite well," Knox replied. "My father runs a tight ship, and all the various concerns, including my air taxi service, are showing healthy profits." "Excellent." Colin remembered another bit of disturbing news that he wanted to check out while he was in America. "We got word over in Scotland about the Wallace pack, 2 brothers each taking human mates. Is any of that happening in your pack?" "Not that I've heard. But I met Aidan and Rourke Wallace last year, and they Both seem happy with their choices. Maybe taking a human mate can work in some cases. It seems bloody reckless to me. Colin had used those very words the last time he'd had an argument about human were mating with his younger brother, Duncan. Knox shrugged. Time will tell. It's a colossal mistake. Colin shuddered at the possibility of humans breaching the security of the werewolf. Through the ages, werewolves had suffered horribly whenever humans had uncovered their existence, so secrecy was the only protection they had. Humans could be business associates, perhaps friends, and occasionally even lovers. But they couldn't be trusted with the knowledge that piques controlled much of the wealth in major cities all over the world. Mating with a human risked losing everything, not to mention how it would dilute the werewolf gene pool. Knox reached for his headset. You could be right, but at this point it's not a problem we're dealing with in Seattle. He turned to Colin. Ready to go? Yes. Or as ready as he'd ever be. The sound of the rotor sabotaged any further conversation, and he was happy to slip back into his jet-lagged stupor. Exhaustion coupled with guilt sapped his desire for small talk. Although he'd spent 5 summers on the island, from the age of 12 until he turned 17, he hadn't been back since. What was done, and he couldn't change anything now, but regret weighed on his soul. He could come up with a million excuses for why he hadn't visited. He'd been busy earning an economics degree. Then he'd dealt with his father's poor health, and eventually he'd taken over as Laird of Glenbarra. But surely in the past 15 years he could have spared a week or two. Nostalgia gripped him as the chopper approached Seattle. The Space Needle rose like an exclamation mark that would forever identify the city, and would forever remind him of the day he'd spent playing tourist with Geraldine. She'd treated him to dinner in the Needle's revolving restaurant where he'd gazed endlessly at the lights that sparkled below them like the Milky Way. Closing his eyes, Colin leaned back against the headrest and dozed. He roused himself as the chopper veered northwest and skimmed over Puget Sound, headed for the San Juans, an archipelago that included dozens of islands large and small. They all had official names on the map, but Colin had forgotten what his aunt's island was called. Now he just thought of it as Lufloret. On his first visit, he told Geraldine that the island looked like a giant clump of broccoli rising from the sea. She'd promptly declared they would call it Lufloret from now on instead of whatever boring name the map showed. She'd laughed whenever she'd told that story. She'd had a great laugh. As Knox began the descent, wind from the spinning blades ruffled water bright as polished chrome. Colin blamed the glare for making his eyes water. Taking off his wayfarers, he wiped away the moisture before settling the sunglasses back in place. Soon he'd walk into Whittier House, and Aunt Geraldine wouldn't be there. That was going to be very tough. A maverick to the end, she'd nixed the idea of a funeral. Her lawyer had read Colin her final instructions over the phone, and they were typical Geraldine. Just dump my ashes, in with Henry's and sprinkle them on happy hour. Beach while you toast us with a very dry martini. Make sure we're shaken, not stirred. Then the lawyer had dropped the bombshell. Geraldine had left all her worldly possessions, the island, the turreted Scottish-style mansion Henry had built for her, and every valuable antique in that mansion, to Colin. It was an incredibly wonderful gesture, but he wished to hell she hadn't done it. Much as he'd loved his irreverent aunt, he had no use for an island and an estate halfway around the world from Glenbarra. Sure, he had some fond memories of Lufloret and Whittier House, but keeping the property would be sentimental and impractical. As the new laird, he couldn't afford to be either. Geraldine's lawyer had provided the name of a reputable real estate agent from Seattle, and Colin had contacted him before leaving Scotland. The agent would arrive the following afternoon, which would give Colin a chance to scatter the ashes and get some sleep. That left the matter of the staff. That old codger Hector was still the groundskeeper, but the others had been hired since Colin had last visited. Perhaps the new owner would need them, but if not, Colin would hand the more recent hires a generous severance check and a letter of recommendation. He'd set up some sort of pension for Hector in recognition of his many years of service. Selling a place that had meant so much to his aunt didn't make him particularly happy. Geraldine had probably hoped that he'd cherish the estate as she had, but he couldn't imagine flying more than 12 hours each way and dealing with an 8-hour time difference on a regular basis. Logically, he had no choice but to unload what could become an albatross around his neck. The proceeds would bolster the MacDowell coffers, and after years of his father's financial neglect and Duncan's carefree lifestyle, the coffers could use some bolstering. The rapid beat of helicopter blades vibrated the crystal chandelier over Luna Reynaud's head and sent music and rainbows dancing through the entry hall. Tension coiled in her stomach. This Scottish laird had the power to ruin everything for her and the rest of the staff if he refused to consider her plan. But he would consider it. He had to. She'd finally found a place where she belonged, and she wasn't about to give that up without a fight. The loss of Geraldine had been a cruel blow, and she grieved along with the rest of the staff. On top of that, she lost this precious haven too. Well, she wouldn't. No doubt Colin would arrive planning to sell the island. Although Geraldine had lovingly recounted tales from the 5 summers he'd spent here, he hadn't been back since, so how much did he really care about it? It was impractical as a second home, or in his case, second castle. Geraldine had called it a house, but no mere house had 4 towers, 16 turrets, 14 bedrooms, 10 fireplaces and 20 giant tapestries. But if Luna could convince Colin that this old pile, as Geraldine used to call it, would make a fabulous vacation spot, half the battle was won. If he'd trust her to manage it for him, then voila, an income stream for him and jobs for her and the staff. Most important of all, she wouldn't have to leave. She planned to appeal to his business sense, but she hoped he had a sentimental streak too. Repeating the stories Geraldine had told her might stir his nostalgic memories and make him reluctant to sell. She wouldn't start her campaign right away though. First she'd let him settle in and recover from his long journey. To help him do that, she'd provide him with every comfort Whittier House had to offer. Preparations for his stay had begun the moment she'd been told of his arrival. When Geraldine was alive, Luna had managed the household while Dulcie and Sybil cleaned, Janet cooked, and Hector took care of the grounds with the help of some local teenaged wers. But so much hinged on Colin's visit that Luna had spent the past few days working side by side with Dulcie and Sybil. She'd oiled woodwork, polished silver, and scrubbed the pink marble floor in the entry hall until she could see her face in it. This morning she'd wielded a duster on an extension pole to clean the magnificent chandelier that greeted visitors when they first walked through the carved front door. Then she'd switched it on to make sure that every facet sparkled. But now late afternoon sunlight streamed through a window set above the massive door, a window placed there specifically to fill the entry hall with rainbows on sunny days. Luna turned off the artificial light. No point in letting Colin think she wasted resources. He was a Scot after all, and they were supposed to be frugal. Although she'd spent the first 12 years of her life in New Orleans, the city that proudly proclaimed let the good times roll, she could be frugal too. Thriftiness was one of the virtues that she intended to mention when she proposed her concept. Self-reliance was another. She'd been on her own since the age of 12 when she'd left New Orleans, and she'd survived just fine. Pulling her phone from the pocket of her tailored slacks, she called Dulcie. Time for y'all to line up. I heard the helicopter. I'll get Sybil. Dulcie's voice was breathless. No doubt she was anxious about this moment too, because she knew that they had to impress their visitor or risk leaving the island forever. Get Janet too. She'll be watching her soap. I know. Janet's skills rivaled those of Emerald, but she was also addicted to soap operas and had a flat screen in the kitchen. Tell her to TiVo it and march herself out here. We want him to fall in love with Whittier House all over again, so fawning is in order. I'll get her. Thanks. I estimate we have less than 5 minutes before Hector meets him at the helipad and brings him in. She mentally crossed her fingers. She didn't worry so much about the behavior of the 2 housekeepers and the cook, who all understood the gravity of the situation. Hector was a different story. He'd been working for Geraldine and Henry ever since their marriage 45 years ago. He considered himself part of the family rather than an employee, and was probably ready to retire now that they were both gone. With nothing to lose, he didn't take kindly to direction. When she'd suggested using the electric cart to transport Colin and his luggage to the house, Hector had rolled his eyes. It's just Colin, for crying out loud. He knows the place backwards and forwards. He doesn't expect that kind of mollycoddling. He might now that he's a laird. Luna wasn't clear on exactly what being a laird entailed, but the title sounded elegant to her. Certainly worthy of being met with an electric cart. It's no more than 100 yards, Hector had said. Ferrying a perfectly healthy were from the helipad to the front door is plain ridiculous, and Colin would think I'd gone senile if I tried it. Most folks have wheels on their suitcases. If he doesn't, I'll help carry. That's plenty hospitable if you ask me. Luna had known better than to argue with Hector, short of driving the cart herself, which she didn't intend to do because she wanted to be waiting in the entry hall with the staff lined up like they did in the movies. She was stuck with letting Colin walk and drag his suitcase along the curved and somewhat bumpy path from the helipad to the front door. Sybil, who was in her mid-40s, arrived in the entry hall ahead of Dulcie and Janet. Short, dark-haired, and plump, Sybil had given up on finding a mate, and now spent her free time making decorative items from driftwood. Dulcie, curvaceous redhead with traces of gray in her curly hair, showed up next. She'd been widowed young and still dreamed of finding someone to share her golden years. That wasn't the case with Janet, a buxom blonde who had no interest in another mate. She'd adored her late husband and couldn't imagine anyone else measuring up. Janet entered the hallway last. She wore a bib apron over her message t-shirt and jeans. Luna recognized the cook's shirt because it was one of Janet's favorites. Spelled out "You can't touch this" in bright red letters across her ample chest. Fortunately, the apron covered most of the message. Geraldine had never required uniforms of her staff, so they all dressed for comfort and personal style. Sybil favored sweats and loose cotton blouses that disguised her ample figure, while Dulcie liked capris and sparkly t-shirts that highlighted her shape. Luna wondered now if Colin would be expecting uniforms. The three female wers looked more like girlfriends who'd met for coffee than a trained staff of professionals. But it was too late to do anything about it now. Besides, with Geraldine gone, Luna wasn't sure how much authority she had to make changes. Probably none, and besides, she didn't want to alienate anyone by implying that their clothing wasn't appropriate. They'd approved of her plan for saving their jobs, but that didn't mean she was in charge of the entire operation, at least not yet. In fact, she was technically the junior member of the group since she was the last one hired. Nobody deferred to her. In fact, all three affectionately teased her about her southern accent and her celibate existence, which was admittedly unusual for a female were of 27. Luna didn't mind the teasing, but she wasn't ready to explain that she was a virgin who'd never dared have a relationship with a were or a human, admitting that would raise a bunch of questions she didn't want to answer. Still, the teasing meant they liked her, and that was a nice feeling. This was the first time she'd stayed in one place long enough to bond with females, were or human. Maybe someday she'd confide her circumstances to her new friends if they all managed to stay here under Colin's ownership. She'd lived on the island less than a year, replacing a were who'd made the mistake of patronizing Geraldine as if age left her mentally incapable. Luna was grateful for that departed were's tactless behavior, because it had allowed Luna to live in a place that had felt like home from the moment she'd arrived. Janet took off her apron and glanced around, as if searching for a place to put it. Now every word on her shirt stood out as if written in flashing neon. "I think wearing the apron is better," Luna said. "That way he knows immediately that you're the cook. He'll be tired from all that traveling, and he's dealing with grief just like the rest of us. He might have trouble remembering who we are and what each of us does." Sybil grinned. "Personally, I think he'll remember that t-shirt, no problem." "My t-shirt?" Janet glanced down at her chest and groaned. "I completely forgot I was wearing this one." She quickly donned the apron again. "I'm not used to having a male around." "Hector's a male," Dulcie pointed out. "I mean a male as in broad shoulders, narrow hips, nice tush. In other words, the anti-Hector." "I hadn't even thought about whether he'd be good-looking or not," Sybil said. "Does anybody know?" "Geraldine showed me a picture that was made when he was 17, Luna said. "He was tall and skinny with big hands and feet, and a beautiful smile, but she decided not to mention that. They'd accuse her of being interested, which she wasn't." Dulcie threw back her shoulders and tugged down the hem of her rhinestone-studded shirt. "You know what they say about big hands and big feet, and he'll probably sound like Sean Connery. I'd love me some Scottish brogue." "Geraldine said he was privately tutored to minimize his accent," Luna said. "Even better." Dulcie smiled. "A cultured Scottish brogue. Janet elbowed her. Cool it, Dulcie. He's 32, so he's young enough to be your kid. Just barely. I may be a wolf, but that doesn't mean I can't be a cougar, too. Plus he's probably pledged to some high place we're back in Scotland, Sybil added. Someone to fill the slot as the next Lairdess. Lairdess? Janet frowned. I don't know beans about Scottish titles, but that can't be right. Sybil started to giggle. Yeah, that has to be wrong. Can you imagine being called your Lairdess? Especially if she has some junk in the trunk. Dulcie got the giggles too. Janet began prancing around with her fanny sticking out. Make way for her. Royal Lairdess. Her Royal Lairdess is coming through. She was in mid-prance, with everyone laughing including Luna, when the front door opened. She swung around to face the door. So much for the dignified greeting she'd planned. Then she looked into the bluest eyes she'd ever seen and forgot every blessed preparation she'd made for this moment. Colin MacDowell was, hands down, the most beautiful creature in the universe. Chapter 2. Apparently Luna had expected someone who looked like the 17-year-old in the picture she'd seen. But that gangly teenager had been replaced by an adult, who took her breath away. His features had matured into crisp, classic lines, strong nose, deep-set eyes, chiseled jaw. If pressed to name the color of his collar-length hair, she'd call it brown. But that wouldn't give an accurate picture of the strands of gold, bronze, and caramel lovingly highlighted by the sunlight pouring through the front door. He wore slacks, a dress shirt unbuttoned at the neck, and a sport coat. On anyone else, the clothes would be ordinary, but Colin, backlit as he was, looked like a god or perhaps an angel, and not one of those gauzy, delicate angels either. Colin radiated power. She drew in a breath and the sweet scent of him filled her with a kind of hunger she'd never felt before. His scent was familiar, as if she'd known him from somewhere, and yet that was impossible. Tucking his sunglasses into the breast pocket of his jacket, he released the handle of his rolling bag and stepped toward her. His smile was a ghost of the one she'd seen in his teenaged picture. Carefree innocence had been replaced with a polite gesture tinged by weariness. She wanted to wrap her arms around him and give whatever comfort she could. Hello. He held out a large hand to her. I'm Colin MacDowell, Geraldine's nephew. A slight accent that sounded almost British flavored his speech. I know. Her words were more an expression of awe than a comment. That rich baritone of his would charm a female regardless of the accent. She took his very warm hand and held on as she gazed at him with rapture. His eyebrows lifted in a subtle but unspoken question. That silent signal brought her back to reality and her plan. She let go of his hand and cleared her throat. We are so pleased to welcome y'all to Whittier House. Y'all. He looked puzzled. You're not from the Trevelyan pack, are you? No, I'm not connected to the Trevelyans, Your Grace, Highness, Lairdness. She should have researched his title and figured out what to call him. She'd been so busy scrubbing and polishing that she hadn't thought of it. Your, Sirness. She winced. That wasn't right either. Behind her she heard a snort. From someone, probably Janet. Colin ducked his head, obviously hiding a smile. Great. Now he was laughing at her. When he looked up again, his face was composed but some of the weariness had left his expression. Colin's fine. Where are you from? New Orleans, Louisiana, sir. Colin. He prompted again. Colin. Saying his name felt like a privilege. She'd have to get over this hero worship, though, if she expected to convince him that he could leave Whittier House in her capable hands. I didn't know anywheres lived that far south. She gave him the story she'd used with everyone. My parents were loners and, after they died, I came up here to be with other wers. It was a partial truth so she could say it without feeling too guilty. And your name is? Oh. Her face grew hot. She couldn't believe she hadn't introduced herself. I'm Luna Reynaud. I was your aunt's personal assistant for about 10 months, and I managed the household for her. I'll bet she also taught you to mix a very dry martini, shaken, not stirred. As a matter of fact, she did. She paused, thinking that might be a subtle hint that he could use a drink. I can fix one in about 2 minutes if you'd like a. I don't need it yet. But her instructions for scattering her, ashes. He looked down and swallowed. Hers and Henry's, that is. She wants me to toast the occasion with her favorite beverage. His barely disguised grief tugged at her heart. On Happy Hour Beach. He raised his head and sorrow clouded his blue eyes. Yes. Bless your heart. Luna's throat tightened. She might have guessed that. Geraldine would want her ashes scattered there along with her husband's. The two urns sat waiting on the mantel of Geraldine's sitting room fireplace, but, as Luna wasn't next of kin, the lawyer hadn't revealed Geraldine's instructions for those ashes. Behind her someone sniffed. Luna suspected it was Sybil, the most tender-hearted of the staff. Another couple of seconds spent on this topic and everyone would be crying, which wouldn't help Colin get through this. Luna injected brisk efficiency into her voice. I'll help with that then. The martini or the scattering? Whatever y'all want. Then I'd like help with both. Absolutely. The urge to wrap her arms around him swamped her again and she tamped it down. Now let me introduce the rest of the staff. She turned to discover that Janet, Dulcie, and Sybil had lined up as they'd originally practiced. Each of them seemed to be working hard to hold it together, which she appreciated. A warm rush of loyalty made her more determined than ever to save everyone's job. She gestured to each one in turn. Janet is our cook and she's amazing. She can make most anything in the world. He stepped forward and shook Janet's hand. Can you make haggis then? To the cook's credit, she didn't blink. Maybe not on short notice, but given a little time to research, I can. Not necessary. I think haggis is dreadful stuff. If you can make salmon the way I remember, then I'll be overjoyed. I think there was a plank involved. I know exactly what you mean and I can do that. Thank you. I'll look forward to it. The soft burr in his voice nearly put Luna into a trance again. She forced herself to concentrate as she introduced Dulcie and Sybil. These two are the housemaids and you'll never find more dedicated and professional workers. You need anything? Buzz them on the intercom. I'll come running, Dulcie said as she shook his hand. And I'll come walking, Sybil said. I don't do that running thing, but I know all the hallway shortcuts, so I'm almost as speedy as Dulcie. Colin smiled at her. Don't rush on my account. All I need right now is a hot shower. Luna thought of him standing in that hot shower and was gripped by a yearning she'd worked to subdue ever since puberty. Normally, whenever she felt desire for a male, she'd been able to block it, giving in to her sexuality when she had no idea how lovemaking affected words would have been reckless. But Colin's potent appeal broke through every defense she'd constructed. Her body grew moist, and she ached in places she'd managed to ignore for years. She hadn't counted on this complication, but she couldn't allow it to distract her from her goal. Hector's voice boomed out from the doorway. Are you going to keep the poor boy standing in the hall forever, or can I take him up to his room? Luna glanced back at the grizzled old were holding Colin's leather carry-on bag. Impatience flattened his mouth into a thin line and his shock of white hair stood on end where he'd run his fingers through it. Logically, he'd feel Geraldine's loss more than anyone here because of his long association with her, so Luna cut him some slack. Perhaps grief made him more cantankerous than usual. She hadn't discussed her plan with him because she was afraid he'd be against. He'd often told her he liked the peace and quiet of this isolated island. If her plan succeeded, it would bring a constant flood of guests. I thought Colin would want to meet everyone, she said. But perhaps that wasn't. I did want that. Colin leveled his blue gaze on her again. Thank you all for coming out to greet me. I wouldn't have wanted to walk into an empty hallway. A hallway without Geraldine in it, Luna realized. That wouldn't have been right, she said. Although she'd had more than a week to adjust to Geraldine being gone, Colin had never stayed in this house without his aunt being here, too. But we're done with the introduction, so Hector can take y'all upstairs. If it's the same room, I know the way. It's the same room, Hector said. I made sure of that. But I'll go with you and see that everything's the way you like it. Dulcie and Sybil both stiffened as if ready to take offense at the suggestion. They hadn't prepared Colin's room well enough. Luna sent them a warning glance, and they kept quiet. In Luna's opinion, Hector had a right to be a little protective of Colin. They would have shared memories of Geraldine that the rest of them did not. Thanks, Hector. Colin, let me know when to mix up that martini. He looked out the front door, which was still open. It's nearly happy hour. Although I suppose if the sun doesn't set until after 9 these days, happy hour could be any time from now until then. Janet could fix us some food to take along if you're getting hungry. That would be a good idea regardless. She didn't want a tipsy were on her hands. Food would be nice, he said. Just sandwiches, something simple. I'll pack a light dinner, Janet said. How soon do you want it to be ready? Colin glanced at his watch. An hour. That's fine. Janet nodded. I'll bring a basket to Geraldine's sitting room. The wet bar's there. I remember. A smile flitted across his face. Then he glanced at Luna. Does that work for you? Of course. I'll be in Geraldine's sitting room in an hour with a martini, shaker and a basket of food. Make sure to bring 2 glasses. I hate to drink alone. All right. Colin turned to Hector. Ready. Been ready. Hector started toward the curving marble staircase and Colin followed. Luna stayed in the hallway with Dulcie, Sybil, and Janet as Colin carried his suitcase up the stairs. He looked about as wonderful from the back as he did from the front. After they disappeared down the corridor, Dulcie was the first to break the silence. Oh baby. She packed a wealth of appreciation into those 2 words. Luna couldn't agree more, but she wasn't about to say so. Thanks for not responding to Hector's remark about the condition of the room. Colin may be the closest thing to family he has left. That's true, Janet said. Whittier House has been Hector's whole life. He's still a pain in the rear, but I'll lay off for now. Dulcie put her hand on her heart and sighed dramatically, because any friend of Colin's is a friend of mine. You might as well give up that project, Dulcie, Sybil said. He only has eyes for our Southern belle here. Heat swept through Luna. That's not true. Yeah, it is. Janet gave her a knowing look. Don't count me out yet, Dulcie said. Janet slung an arm around Dulcie's shoulders. Sorry, old girl. Luna has the inside track on this one, and it's about time our little magnolia blossom had some romance in her life. Luna's pulse skyrocketed at Janet's implication, but she shook her head and adopted a businesslike tone. Not happening. Too much at stake. But sweetie, Janet said, that's exactly why you should seduce that beautiful were. The male of the species tends to mellow out after good sex. Roll in the hay might tip the scales in your favor. Both the subject and her lack of experience caused her face to flame. I don't think so. I'm not great at that kind of thing. Dulcie grinned at her. I wouldn't worry about it, Toots. Something tells me he is. Colin had dreaded walking into Whittier House now that Geraldine was gone, but it hadn't been too bad thanks to Luna Reynaud. Yes, her wavy dark hair, fair skin and wide green eyes would capture any male's attention, but it wasn't her beauty that had lifted his heavy heart. It was her endearing lack of sophistication. He could see immediately why Geraldine had hired her. Earnest sincerity was a quality his aunt had prized, and Luna had that, plus a subtle vulnerability that inspired his protective instincts. He had no doubt Luna had taken excellent care of Geraldine, but Geraldine had probably mothered Luna more than a little bit. It was obviously a happy household even in grief. He'd felt better the minute he'd heard laughter coming from behind the closed door. He'd known from Hector's scowl that the groundskeeper disapproved of laughter at a time like this. But Colin had been pathetically grateful for that first glimpse of Luna's smiling face when he'd opened the door. She'd banished the shadows he'd expected to find and had replaced them with sunshine. Next time he saw her, he'd ask what they'd been laughing about. He liked knowing that Geraldine had continued to surround herself with cheerful people. The one exception was Hector, who had always been on the grumpy side, even 15 years ago. So everyone's new except you then? He said as they headed toward the room at the end of the corridor, the same one Colin had been given as a teenager. Luna's new. The others have all been here about 10 years, I guess. And how long has Luna been around? Pretty name for a pretty were. Not quite a year. She seems like a good sort. Hector didn't respond. Colin glanced at him. You don't like her? It's not a matter of like or don't like. She's hiding something. I take bets on it. Such as? Not sure. Apparently my aunt trusted her. Yeah. Colin had a sudden thought. Hector's nose could be out of joint if he'd expected to be part of scattering the ashes. Listen, if you'd like to go with me down to Happy Hour Beach instead of Luna, I'll ask her to. Hell no. I'm glad to have you two take care of it. Not my thing. Anyway, we're here. He gestured for Colin to go ahead of him into the bedroom at the End of the hall. Let's get you settled. Tabling the subject of Luna for now, Colin walked into the room Geraldine had chosen for him on his first visit. In the far right corner, a spiral metal staircase led to a trap door that opened onto the crenellated tower above. No teenager could resist a feature like that, and somehow she'd known despite having no children herself. The room was achingly familiar, with tattered paperbacks in the bookshelf, along with a stack of board games. 2 sports pennants, one for the Seahawks and one for the Mariners, were tacked to the wall over the bookcase. Grief lodged in his throat as he was swept back to his first summer, the summer after he'd reached puberty. He'd known puberty would bring the ability to shift. All children were carefully instructed in how to deal with that change, but being told what to expect was a far cry from actually experiencing it. A few times over the years he'd heard humans complain about those miserable years when they were neither child nor adult. He'd had to laugh. Sure, human kids had hormonal issues and zits, but they didn't periodically shift into a creature with fangs and fur. Try dealing with that on a first date. Until he'd learned to control that ability, he couldn't go to a movie or an arcade frequented by human teens without worrying that the urge would suddenly come upon him. All a teenage boy had to fear was an unexpected erection. Worse, risked an unexpected transformation that could get them killed. Now he wouldn't trade his status for anything, but those teenage years had been hell. His Aunt Geraldine and Uncle Henry had offered this island as a refuge while he was learning to adapt to a confusing new reality. Colin had liked Henry okay, but he'd adored Geraldine, who had seemed to understand his youthful insecurities. Damn it, he should have come to see her when Henry had died several years ago. He should have flown over to offer whatever comfort he could, but he hadn't, and that failure would haunt him for a long time. Far as I know, nothing's been changed in here, Hector said. Aired and cleaned, of course, but not changed. I'm glad it hasn't changed. That first summer, his aunt had been anxious about whether he'd like the drapes and bed linen she'd chosen for him, which depicted the night sky in silver against a dark blue background. He'd thought the pattern was beautiful, and it had sparked an interest he still had. When she'd realized the astronomy decor suited him, she'd bought him a telescope. Winters were rainy here, but summers were generally clear, and he'd spent hours on the flat roof of the tower studying the heavens. Colin set down his suitcase and turned to Hector. Do you know if the telescope's still around? Probably in the closet. She wouldn't have gotten rid of it. No, she wouldn't have, because she probably thought he might come back and use it again. Walking over to the closet, he opened the door. The telescope box sat on a shelf over the clothes rod. All the wooden hangers were empty, except one. He turned on the light and his heart squeezed. She'd kept the Seattle space needle-hooded sweatshirt he'd bought and left here to wear on cool summer nights. Taking off his sport coat, he hung it up, unzipped the sweatshirt, and slipped it from the hanger. Maybe it smelled a little musty, but he didn't care. Maybe it was a little tight through the shoulders. Didn't matter. He tugged it on and zipped it partway up. Then he glanced toward the doorway where Hector stood. I miss her like the devil, Hector. The groundskeeper nodded. For a moment the two gazed at each other in perfect agreement. Chapter 3. Luna changed into jeans, a forest green sweater, and canvas slip-ons before heading to Geraldine's sitting room. Janet had been there ahead of her, and a wicker picnic basket sat on the wet bars counter. Luna smelled roast beef sandwiches and tried to remember when she'd last eaten. She'd been too involved in preparations for Colin to think about it. With an ease born of practice, she opened the liquor cabinet under the counter, took out the gin and vermouth, and began mixing a shaker of martinis. The stainless steel container held 5 servings, and she filled it to capacity out of habit. She hadn't performed this ritual in more than a week, and doing it now, without Geraldine kibitzing from a bar stool on the other side of the counter, felt strange. Luna had learned how to make the drink exactly as her employer had liked it, with only a whisper of vermouth to flavor the gin and a dash of bitters. Geraldine had encouraged Luna to share in the happy hour tradition, and she'd eventually become used to the strong taste. But Geraldine usually consumed the lion's share of the shaker's contents. Happy Hour Beach was Geraldine's favorite place to enjoy drinks in the early evening, but the sitting room with its cozy fireplace and shelves of books had run a close second. Geraldine had mentioned that she and Henry had often enjoyed their drinks here when the weather was too ugly to be outside. Luna wished that she'd had a chance to meet Henry too, but that would have been impossible. Geraldine hadn't needed to hire a personal assistant until after Henry had died, and now they were both gone. Although Luna didn't feel exactly right participating in this informal ceremony to scatter the ashes Colin had asked, and as Geraldine's heir he called the shots. She hoped her presence would help. She'd never scattered anyone's ashes before. As she poured gin into the martini shaker, she thought about the above-ground tombs in New Orleans and the noisy parades for the deceased. This happy hour beach plan wasn't quite the same, but Luna felt sure that Geraldine had meant for it to be a celebration of life, not a mournful acknowledgement of death. It's amazing how well I remember my way around this place. Colin walked into the sitting room, his hair still a little damp from his shower, his amazing scent now mixed with that of shampoo and soap. He changed into jeans, running shoes and a black t-shirt, but it was the zip-up hoodie he wore over the t-shirt that caught Luna's attention. An obvious souvenir from the Space Needle, it was at least a size too small for him. She suspected it had sentimental value, and the tight fit emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, so she wasn't complaining. She couldn't imagine any female would complain about sharing space with Colin MacDowell, who could look good no matter what clothes he wore or didn't wear. She took a shaky breath and rerouted her thoughts away from that dangerous subject. Janet might think sex was a good tactic, but Luna wasn't going there, no matter how much her body wanted to. "I like your sweatshirt," she said. "Me too. It doesn't fit the way it did when I was 17, but it was hanging in my closet upstairs, so I put it on." His gaze went to the pair of urns on the mantel and slid away again. "Sounds like the right move to me." She added ice to the martini shaker, screwed the lid on tight, and tucked the shaker into an insulated carrier Geraldine had bought expressly for trips to Happy Hour Beach. The carrier had a divided section for 2 stem glasses, a place for a small jar of olives, and another compartment for toothpicks. "That carrier's new," Colin said. "When I was here they used a canvas bag." Luna lifted the carrier by its strap. "Progress. Do you want to take folding chairs?" "When I'd have happy hour with Geraldine we took 2 camp chairs. There used to be big pieces of driftwood on that beach. There still are, but Geraldine didn't like to perch on them, especially after a couple of martinis." Colin smiled. "I can understand that, but I only plan to have 1 drink, so the driftwood should work for me." "For me too." She'd probably overdone it on the martinis, but she'd heard that Scotsmen liked their liquor. Maybe he'd change his mind and have more than 1. "Then let's forget the chairs and just go." "Okay." She started to pick up the wicker basket by its handle. Colin moved toward her. "I can get that. In fact, let me carry the drinks and the food." "I'd rather you took the urns." He hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Right." Shoulders back, jaw set, he walked straight to the mantel and gripped an urn in each of his large hands. "Let's go." Luna led the way back out into the entry hall and through the front door. The sun had drawn closer to the horizon, but darkness wouldn't come for another 2 hours at least. A wind whipped Luna's hair back from her face as she gazed out at the island, dotted expanse of blue-gray water. Geraldine would have loved this sunny weather, she said. "Yes." Colin sounded subdued. Luna turned to him. "It's not really my place to say, but I think she would have wanted us to make this a joyful occasion." "Yes, you're right." He took a deep breath. "So we'll do that. Lead on." "That's the spirit." She gave him a quick smile of encouragement. Then she took a path to her left, which bordered a grassy area where Geraldine had often set up a croquet game. If Colin approved Luna's plan, she wanted to offer guests a chance to play here. It would be a shame not to. Once past the croquet lawn, she started down narrow stone steps that descended about 10 feet to a small crescent beach that faced west. Colin followed his footsteps, sure, his breathing steady, because Luna had made it a policy to avoid close encounters with eligible males. Being alone with a virile were like Colin gave her the jitters. She reminded herself he was Geraldine's cherished nephew, not someone to be feared. In fact, if she ever wanted to have a sexual experience, Colin would be a safe candidate given how much Geraldine had trusted him. But he also had the power to decide whether she'd be staying on the island. She couldn't risk doing anything that would adversely affect his decision to let her open and in. When they reached the sand, Colin let out a sigh. Just the same as I remembered. That's comforting in a way. Geraldine is gone, but the beach remains the way it's always been. It does. The water was calm, and the waves lapped at the shoreline in a lazy rhythm. Luna wanted this to be a celebratory occasion, but the beauty of the little cove seemed to emphasize that the former owner would never enjoy it again. She'd sat on the beach with Geraldine about 2 weeks ago, and Luna remembered that last evening on the beach with fondness. They'd watched a spectacular sunset while drinking martinis and eating finger sandwiches. Memories of Geraldine swirled through Luna's mind as she set the picnic basket and the insulated carrier next to a huge piece of gray driftwood, its trunk as big around as she was. It would make a good seat for both her and Colin, provided they didn't drink too much gin. At the moment, drinking too much gin to fill the void Geraldine had left was an appealing thought. Luna, look. The urgency in Colin's voice shattered her melancholy. Glancing up, she gasped in delight as a pair of orcas arched out of the water about 20 yards offshore. Their black and white, tuxedo-like markings glistened in the late afternoon sun as they undulated in tandem through the calm water. I'd forgotten. Still clutching a funerary urn in each hand, Colin watched the whales make their way past the island until they became indistinguishable from the movement of the gentle waves. He set the urns in the sand and turned to Luna. How could I forget about the orcas? They were one of my favorite things about the summers the first spent on this island. 15 years is a long time. Too long. His expression was bleak. I loved it here. I should have made it a priority to come back for a visit. She knew you were busy. Luna hated to see him in pain, but maybe this meant her plan had a chance of succeeding. She was proud of your accomplishments. She talked about me all the time. Considering she left everything to you, it's safe to say you were the son she never had. Feet braced apart, hands bracketing his hips, Colin stared at the sand beneath his feet, and a bloody inattentive one at that. He shifted his focus to the horizon. At first I thought it was my duty to step aside and allow my younger brother to have his turn over here, but he wasn't interested. Geraldine mentioned your brother. I gather he's a handful. Duncan's what you'd call a party animal. He thought spending the summer over here sounded as exciting as watching a sheep grow wool. He must be very different from y'all. He glanced over at her. You mean different from my whole family or just me? Just y'all, you. She flushed. Sorry, just the way I talk. As confusing enough for someone who's not Southern, let alone someone who's not even from this country. His blue gaze gentled. Please don't worry about it. I enjoy the way you talk. I enjoy the way y'all talk too. Your voice reminds me of Geraldine's. His eyebrows lifted. Then maybe I need to pitch it somewhat lower. That surprised a laugh out of her. I didn't mean you sounded feminine, I know. He flashed a grin. Just teasing. Her breath caught. He really was gorgeous with the sun picking out the gold in his hair and bronzing his skin. She could get lost in those blue eyes and that warm smile. No wonder Geraldine had loved him. He'd be easy to love. I'm not sure what I did to put that look on your face, he said, but it's very becoming. Oh dear. Once again she was staring at him as if she had a schoolgirl crush. She cleared her throat. I was thinking that we need to get started. He gave her a half smile, as if he didn't believe a word of that. Drinking or scattering? Your choice. He nodded. I suppose it is, so I choose drinking first, scattering second. Think I'll handle this better with a little alcohol in my system. Me too. She knelt beside the insulated carrier and unzipped the lid. Can I help? His voice was very close. She turned to find him crouched right beside her. His scent and body heat were unbelievably distracting, but asking him to move away would be rude, and he wouldn't understand why. Most were females would be thrilled to have him nearby, and they wouldn't be skittish about it either. Forcing herself to concentrate, she pulled the martini shaker out of the carrier and handed it to him. Y'all can pour. How many does this thing hold? 5, but we certainly don't have to drink them all. Geraldine thought it was better to be oversupplied than undersupplied for a trip to Happy Hour Beach. I remember that. She wouldn't let me drink martinis with her and Henry, but I was welcome to join them with a 6-pack of soda. He stood and began rattling the ice in the stainless steel container. Every time I hear a bartender doing This I think shaken, not stirred. Was Geraldine a 007 fan back then too? Luna set the stemmed glasses upright in the carrier and added the olives. Rabid. It's a wonder Henry wasn't jealous, the way she carried on about Sean Connery. But Henry was a good sport about it. He was daft about her. From things she said to me, I think she was daft about him too. Luna didn't normally use the word daft, but she thought it sounded more cultured than crazy. She picked up both glasses and carefully stood so she wouldn't dump the olives. She must have been deeply in love, Colin said. The story was that she came over to Vancouver on vacation, met Henry, and never returned to Scotland. The Whittier pack in Vancouver wasn't happy because Henry was supposed to mate with someone else, and the MacDowell pack wasn't happy because she'd abandoned them for some Canadian were. No wonder they decided to buy an island and live by themselves. She held out the glasses. Fill 'em up. We need to toast Geraldine and Henry, who valued their own happiness over the opinions of others. That they did. Colin poured the clear liquid into each glass. They marched to their own drummer, which isn't common in our world. No, she felt a prick of unease. It might be Colin's world, but she still wasn't convinced it was hers. Sometimes she thought it could be, and other times she felt like a fraud. Keeping his glass level, he leaned down, settled the shaker in the carrier, and flipped the lid over it. Then he straightened and touched the rim of his glass to hers. To Henry and Geraldine, who created the life they wanted. To Henry and Geraldine. She met his gaze and added a fervent wish that he'd allow her to create the life she wanted here on La Florette. As she took a sip of her drink, she watched him from beneath her lashes. His mouth fascinated her. She'd had one kiss in her life, a hard, demanding, and disgusting kiss forced on her by a guest at one of the hotels where she'd worked as a maid. If that was kissing, she wanted no part of it. But she couldn't imagine Colin behaving with such aggression and lack of finesse. He took a long swallow and glanced up. Nicely done, Luna. James Bond would approve of this martini. Thank you. Shall we sit? He gestured toward the giant piece of driftwood. Okay. She picked out a level spot and settled down on the water-polished wood. Colin surveyed the driftwood and chose a section about 2 feet away from her. Balancing on the driftwood, he nudged off his shoes. Ah, that's better. Geraldine didn't think anyone should wear shoes on the beach. That's right. Luna had thought about that, but she hadn't wanted to appear overly casual. If Colin was going barefoot, then she could too. Toeing off her shoes, she nudged them aside and wiggled her toes in the warm sand. The familiar sensation soothed her. Geraldine believed in enjoying life to the fullest, whatever that meant to someone. That she did. Colin took another swallow of his martini and gazed out at the water, and she encouraged others to do the same. I wonder what? She glanced over at him. His attention remained fixed on the horizon, as if he were looking for answers. Maybe I hesitated to come back here because I knew I wasn't following her advice. How is that? He sipped his martini. If I stop to evaluate my choices since my 17th summer, they've all been based on what my family wanted, what my pack needed. Never on what I needed. She went very still, afraid to do the wrong thing, say the wrong thing, and ruin this moment. She doubted he confided that sort of thing very often, if ever. Perhaps he was lulled into this reflective mood by the private beach, the martini, and the reminder that life could end at any time. He glanced over at her. Did she give you the same advice? Yes. Geraldine had been the first person in years who Luna had allowed close enough to give her advice. He drank more of his martini. And what do you want, Luna Reynaud? She could tell him, but it seemed too soon, and a business discussion wasn't appropriate tonight. She drew circles in the sand with her toes. What? Everyone wants, I suppose. Fulfillment, joy, a feeling of security. She looked up. How about y'all? The same perhaps, although a need for security can end up weighing a person down. He studied her as he sipped his martini. You do realize I'm planning to sell this place? I assumed so. If you have to leave La Florette as a result, what will you do? She met his gaze. I'll be fine. She didn't want him to think she had no alternative to staying on here. That would look like desperation, not a solid business plan. Financially you will be fine because I'll give you a great recommendation and a generous severance package. But you seem to be without strong pack ties. And so I can see how the island Works for me the way it worked for Henry and Geraldine? Essentially, yes. Those who choose to stay here don't care to be closely involved with the pack. That's not a common Wer profile. No, it isn't. She held his gaze. I'm a little different. Another half. Truth that she hoped would satisfy him. And that's why you fit in with Geraldine and the others, he said, his voice gentle. And they may be able to keep their jobs under new ownership because Whittier House needs a staff, but chances are slim there will be a place here for you. A personal assistant is a more specialized position. He sounded genuinely worried about her future plans. Unexpectedly, her eyes misted and a lump rose to her throat. Damn. This was no time to get emotional just because he was being considerate. 4 years she'd kept a sturdy wall around herself that had prevented anyone from getting close enough to worry about her. Geraldine had partially penetrated that wall, leaving Luna more vulnerable than she'd been since losing her mother 19 years ago. But she couldn't expect Colin to trust her with his legacy if she got teary at the slightest hint of kindness. She needed to project an air of calm control and competency. Clearing her throat, she looked him straight in the eye. I appreciate your concern, but I've been on my own for most of my life. I can take care of my... Chapter 4. Taken aback by her sudden switch in mood, Colin stared at Luna. A second ago, she'd been leaning toward him, her expression soft and vulnerable, her eyes damp. She'd looked in need of comfort, and he'd considered putting down his drink and drawing her into his arms. But this new Luna wouldn't welcome that gesture. She sat ramrod straight on the driftwood, her chin firm and her eyes clear. For some reason he couldn't fathom, she'd armored herself against him. Far be it for him to force unwanted concern on anyone. I didn't mean to imply you couldn't take care of yourself, he said in his best Laird of Glenbarra manner. She gasped. I was rude, wasn't I? I'm sorry. Y'all were only trying to be nice. And apparently I insulted you in the process. He drained the rest of his martini. Not at all. She sighed. I just don't want to appear helpless and without resources. I'm sure you're not. He must have hit one of her sore points, and if she'd been on her own for a long time, her ability to take care of herself would be a source of pride. Yet she'd allowed him a glimpse of her vulnerability, and she probably regretted that. Colin thought of Duncan's favorite slogan, when in doubt, have another round. He raised his martini glass. I'm going to have another one of these. After all. Flipping back the soft lid of the carrier, he pulled out the shaker. Can I top off yours? Yes please. She held out her glass. And I apologize. Nothing's gone quite as I planned. Planned? He tried to make sense of that statement as he filled their glasses. What sort of plan did you have? Maybe I should lay all my cards on the table and be done with it. That got his full attention. Quickly tucking the shaker back in the carrier, he faced her, all his senses alert. Please do. I intended to give you a chance to rest up first, but here we are drinking martinis and having a conversation about my future. I didn't expect that. Has thrown me off. Go on. His drink forgotten, he gazed at her with new understanding. She hadn't survived on her own all these years without being resourceful. Geraldine's death had created a problem for her, and she'd obviously come up with a scheme to solve it. Apparently the scheme involved him. She clutched her martini glass in both hands as she focused those green eyes on him with the intensity of twin lasers. I have a proposition for y'all. For one wild moment he thought she might mean a sexual proposition, and his pulse leaped. But she had an air of innocence about her that didn't jibe with that scenario. I suspected as much. Instead of selling Whittier House in La Florette, turn it into a premier vacation spot. He was aghast. And have strangers running all over the island? The minute the words were out of his mouth, he realized how idiotic they sounded. He planned to sell to strangers, and they could allow anyone they chose to run all over it. See, I knew it. This place is special to you. Of course it is. He took a gulp of his martini. But I have to put sentimentality aside, because selling is the only reasonable course of action. Not necessarily. She took a careful sip of her drink and glanced up at him. I've worked in hotels all my life. Not to brag on myself, but I've learned every aspect of the business, and I'm good at it. I started out cleaning rooms, but then I moved up into management. I understand basic bookkeeping and I know how to turn a profit. You want to make Whittier House into a hotel. He couldn't imagine such a thing. But it's filled with valuable antiques and tapestries. Strangers could ruin. Were y'all planning to take those things back to Scotland? She had him there. He sighed and shook his head. MacDowell House is already stuffed with antiques. I'd love to convince my mother and father to sell at least half of them so we could walk through rooms without bumping into things. So these would stay with the house or be sold then? He swallowed another mouthful of his drink. Yes. And the thought of selling Aunt Geraldine's things tore at his heart, but turning the place into a hotel didn't make him very happy either. It would be an exclusive inn, Luna said. Booking a room would require references. I'd make sure the guests behaved themselves. He gazed at her and tried to imagine how a sweet creature with a voice that sounded like warm honey could possibly control a pack of rowdy wurs. But he'd already gotten into trouble suggesting that she wasn't capable of taking care of herself, so he said nothing. Y'all don't believe I could keep the peace, right? He couldn't help smiling at a mental picture of her standing in the middle of the drawing room cradling a shotgun as she demanded proper behavior from her. Yes. I don't know. Could you? Absolutely. I would set the tone right from the start. Coming to Whittier House would be a privilege, not a chance to act up. A privilege they'd pay for. Of course, and pay handsomely too. Matching his smile, she lifted her glass to her lips and drank. He loved looking at her mouth. Her pink lipstick had left a print on her glass and he found that sexy. I must be getting peshed on gin because I'm starting to consider this daft concept of yours. Luna's gaze softened. Geraldine sometimes said she was peshed or bluttered. He waited for a pang of longing to subside before he spoke again. I wish I'd given myself the chance to get peshed with Geraldine. He polished off the last of his martini. And speaking of the old girl, we have a job to do. Pushing the base of her half-full martini glass into the sand, Luna stood. I'm ready. So am I. Colin secured his glass in the sand too, although he didn't have to worry if it tipped over because it was empty. He'd also eaten both olives. He thought Geraldine would have relished the idea of having her ashes scattered by a couple of slightly peshed wurs. There was a little more martini mix in the shaker, and once they dealt with the ashes, Colin planned to suggest they drain the shaker's contents. He crouched down next to the simple urns, each with a Scottish thistle pattern embossed on one side. Her instructions said to dump hers in with his, but I don't know which is which. His is the bronze finish and hers is the silver. She picked them out years ago. Then here goes. He took the top off each urn and picked up the silver one. As part of a large clan, he'd taken part in many such ceremonies, and he knew some of the ash would be powdery enough to fly around if he didn't move slowly. So he stood up to pour, leaned over and emptied the silver urn gradually into the bronze one. You look like you're a pro at dealing with ashes. Her voice was subdued. It's part of a pack leader's job to know. He finished pouring, set the silver urn in the sand, and replaced the top on the bronze one. When he picked it up, he discovered that the combined ashes plus the weight of the urn made for a hefty burden. He'd never dealt with two sets of ashes at once. So we scatter them now? Not yet. Colin braced his bare feet in the sand. She wants them shaken, not stirred. You're kidding. No, lass, I'm not. He held the urn like a giant cocktail shaker. She clapped a hand over her mouth and her green eyes sparkled with suppressed laughter. Looking at her, he couldn't help grinning himself. I can see this won't be a particularly solemn occasion. She took her hand away from her mouth to reveal her smile. Geraldine wouldn't want solemn. You're right. I certainly hope I can do this without falling down, though. Celebration is one thing. A comedy routine is another. He began to shake the urn. It wasn't easy, especially considering the 2 martinis he'd consumed on an empty stomach. He staggered once, bringing a gasp of alarm from Luna. Don't panic. He regained his balance. I've got it. You've probably shaken them enough. She wouldn't want y'all to rupture a disc. That would be bad. He paused to catch his breath. All right then. Time to scatter. Where exactly? She didn't get that specific. Just in the sand. Is the tide coming in or going out? Let me think for a minute. She paused. It's coming in. Then if we go down near the waterline, the waves will eventually cover the ashes and gradually draw them out to sea. I think Geraldine would have liked that idea. So do I, but as she's not here to offer advice, we have to use our best judgment. Right. Near the waterline it is, then. Colin hoisted the urn to his shoulder. As he started toward the water, he'd never thought of this as a physically taxing ceremony, but he was working up a sweat. It was a wee crescent beach, not even half a kilometer from one rocky promontory to the other. Colin made for the north tip, figuring he would need the entire length in order to empty the urn. A breeze off the water meant he'd need to face the shore as he moved along or risk being covered in ashes. When he reached the farthest end of the beach, he set the urn in the damp sand and caught his breath. Luna came up beside him. Are we going to scoop out handfuls? She didn't sound eager to do that. No. I'll just walk along and pour the ashes as I go. Should we say something first? Yes. Yes, we certainly should. It was a measure of his exhausted and peshed state that he'd been about to dump Geraldine and Henry on the sand without a single blessing. He glanced at Luna. Will you take hold of my hand then? Of course. She offered her hand without hesitation. Her skin was soft, but her grip was firm. Gratitude rushed through him for this human contact at such a time, but gratitude wasn't all he felt. He became aware of her in a way that wasn't appropriate during a funeral ceremony. He glanced toward the water as they stood in silence. He should be thinking of what he was going to say, but instead he simply absorbed the wonder of her touch. The smell of salt water and sand blended with her female scent, and the combination was more intoxicating than any drink invented. He'd never realized how inherently sexy beaches were. Perhaps he should release her hand. He did not. Her fingers tightened around his. May I say something first? I. She drew in a breath and spoke in a steady voice. Geraldine, thank y'all for being a friend and mentor to this wandering were. I will never forget your kindness. Rest in peace with your beloved Henry. Beautiful lass. He glanced at her. Well done. She met his gaze and her eyes were moist. Your turn, she said softly. I'm lucky to have you with me for this, Luna. Bless your heart, I feel lucky to be here. Now say your piece. She would want some Scottish parts in there, I think. He nodded. I've been thinking about that. Turning back to the shimmering water, he kept a firm grip on Luna's hand. He wanted to do a proper job, and holding on to her helped him focus. Maybe a bit like this. He cleared his throat. Geraldine and Henry, we come to this wee beach you loved so well to honor the beauty in thy character, the harmony in thy home, and the love in thy hearts. Very nice. He squeezed her hand. Not done yet. Oh, sorry. And may thy martinis in the afterlife be shaken, and not stirred. Blessed be. From the corner of his eye he saw her smile. Okay then. Yes. Reluctantly he let go of her hand. Then it's time I start the pouring. He knew in advance it would be an aerobic task, so he unzipped his sweatshirt and pulled it off. He sighed in relief as cool air penetrated his sweat-dampened t-shirt. Too warm. He caught her quick glance of appraisal, even though she immediately looked away again. I didn't realize it would be such a physical job. So she was aware of him in that way too. He'd file the information away for later. Now was not the time to be getting romantic notions. Could you please hang on to this for me? He held the sweatshirt toward her. Be happy to. She folded the sweatshirt over her arm. You might want to stand back. Facing away from the water, he picked up the urn. Some of the ashes will probably blow toward you. Then I'll walk along ahead of y'all and pick up anything that might be a tripping hazard, like pieces of driftwood. Brilliant. He hadn't thought of that. He'd be concentrating on pouring ashes and not watching for obstacles in his path. Tripping could have unfortunate consequences for everyone, including the deceased. Then let's get started. He started to tip the urn. Wait. He paused in mid-tip. We should sing as we go along. And I know just the song. Amazing Grace. You're right again, lass. Geraldine loved that song, especially played on the pipes. If I'd been thinking, I would have brought along a portable player of some kind. But we can sing. Aye. Luna positioned herself about 3 steps in front of his planned path. We'll start on 3. 1, 2, 3. She began to sing. Off-key. Colin joined in with gusto in hopes that his voice would coax hers into some sort of compliance. But no. She sang with greater enthusiasm to be sure, but not greater tunefulness. Oh well. It was the thought that counted. Pouring ashes and singing along. With Luna's tone-deaf rendition of Amazing Grace, he realized that Geraldine would have loved this scene. She wouldn't have cared whether the tune was performed well. She would have been delighted that it was performed at all, and with love at that. Gauging how much to pour as they moved down the beach took most of his concentration, but he was aware of Luna clearing his path of debris. Miraculously, everything came out even, the length of beach, the amount of ashes, and the last words of the song. The sun had not set, but it hung low on the horizon and had begun to turn a rich shade of gold. A pair of gulls wheeled overhead, their cries mingling with the soft lap of the waves moving steadily up the beach. Colin emptied the urn and set it on the sand with a sigh of accomplishment. He'd done it. No, they had done it. The ceremony wouldn't have been as perfectly imperfect without Luna. She stood close beside him because they'd run out of beach. Tipping her face upward to gaze at him, she smiled with obvious pleasure and satisfaction. Her face reflected the radiance of the sun, and Colin couldn't imagine anyone looking more beautiful than she did at this moment. "Thank you," he murmured. And then, because it seemed like the right thing to do, he leaned down and kissed her full on the mouth. He'd probably expected on some level that she'd kiss him back. She didn't. How embarrassing was that? Yet she'd shown interest in him, or maybe he'd been mistaken. Leaped to conclusions. He felt like an ass. Pulling away, he felt heat spreading from his neck up to his cheeks. My apologies. I shouldn't have done that. She looked dazed. Don't apologize. I liked it. You liked it? Yes. She reached up and touched her mouth with her fingertips. I was hoping it might last a little longer. But you weren't kissing me back. It was her turn to blush. I suppose not, but you see, I don't have much that is. I'm not very. He stared at her in confusion. If he didn't know better, he'd think she was completely inexperienced. Yet she'd been on her own for years, and she appeared to be in her mid-20s. Sexuality was celebrated in the culture, and although choosing a mate for life might be delayed, sexual satisfaction was not. Her blush deepened and she lowered her gaze. Never mind. I'm sure you're famished after all that effort. We should eat. She turned and started back up to their driftwood bench. Wait a minute. He laid a gentle hand on her arm. What's going on here? Luna. She glanced back at him. Something that shouldn't be going on. Y'all have a lovely mouth, and I was curious, but kissing someone I hope to do business with isn't a very bright idea, especially when I'm no good at it. How can you be no good at it? Haven't you ever? He saw the answer in her eyes. But I don't understand. You're beautiful. That's nice to hear. Surely you've had wers who were interested in you. She shrugged. I don't know. I've never encouraged that kind of thing. Never trusted anyone enough. Although he still had trouble imagining that she was virginal at this stage in her life, his gut told him that no one could fake the kind of reaction she'd had to his kiss. Does that mean that you trusted me a little since you allowed me to kiss you? He would hardly call it a kiss, but she might think it was, given her apparent innocence. I suppose I would tend to trust someone Geraldine trusted, but that doesn't mean we should be kissing. She gently pulled away from his grasp. Come along, Colin. If you're not starving, I am. Fascinated by this unexpected revelation, he followed her back to their temporary picnic site. He was still attracted to her, and she was attracted to him, although she might not realize how much if she'd never allowed herself to feel passion. The last time he'd been with a virgin, he'd been a fumbling fool, only somewhat more knowledgeable than the female where he'd had sex with. They'd made a hash of it, but that had been more than 15 years ago. He couldn't imagine that someone as full of life as Luna was happy embracing celibacy. Judging from her response to him, her virginal state was a source of embarrassment to her. If she'd allow him to, he could help her over that hurdle. The more he thought about it, the more he believed it was the gentlemanly thing to do.